Hello, everyone. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes to allow everyone to come in. In the meantime, if you want to tell us in the chat where you're from, we'd love to hear it. Welcome, everyone, to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director and co-founder of Jane Austen and Company. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. If you've missed our previous programs, you can find them all for free, recorded on our website, janeaustenandco.org. We hope that you have all enjoyed the series this season and will continue supporting our venture by sharing your opinions in a survey or by donating to the Jane Austen Summer Program. Donations help programming such as tonight's program, as well as teacher scholarships and essay contests for students. After the talk, we'll talk more about how you can support our series, as well as announce our creative writing contest winners. So please be sure to stick around for the full length of the event. Tonight, I am so happy to welcome you all to the final speaker in our 2021 series, Race in the Regency. Tonight, Devoney Looser will be presenting Slavery, Anti-Slavery, and the Austen Family. This has been such a wonderful series so far, and we are so lucky to have had all of you join us for the last couple months with all of our wonderful speakers. And while we're sad to see the series end, we know that tonight's event will be a fitting finale. Before we begin, however, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Danielle Christmas, to speak some more about what the series means this year.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Christmas, and I'm an assistant professor of English and comparative literature at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I research and teach about the relationship between cultural production, like Jane Austen's novels, and their socioeconomic context, including the economic politics of slavery. It is this work that has allowed me to co-host this series, Race in the Regency, which started in February and concludes this afternoon. The speakers in this series have explored the role of race, nationalism, imperialism, and identity in the works and times of Jane Austen, as well as in literary and film adaptations of the time period. Perhaps you attended my talk on the Zong crisis in Mansfield Park this past February, or joined us for another lecture by any number of the featured speakers we've had the honor of hosting since then. If so, and you're back in anticipation of this entirely different and yet wholly connected presentation on how to make race in the Regency accessible for all of us, then you already understand the ethos of this series: to gather a diverse cross-section of intellectual and professional points of view and grow together in conceptualizing what race means for understanding the Regency and what Jane Austen's Regency means for our own complicated notions of race. For those of you familiar with my introductory spiel, I'd like to change things up on the occasion of our final Race in the Regency event. If you have the sort of inquiring mind that made you seek out this event, it's safe to assume that you're sufficiently engaged in the contemporary discourse that makes this statement truer today than ever in my lifetime. It's really challenging to talk and think about race right now. It's uncomfortable, complicated, and sufficiently fraught that voluntarily entering just such a conversation requires an unusual degree of intellectual bravery. This is especially true when it comes to our own source material, the Austen novels which so many of us go to for relaxation and reprieve, rather than as an additional site of fraught discourse. If recent events have taught us anything, it's that racial context of Austen's time and our own is something we should have been thinking critically about all along. So this isn't to say that we deserve special recognition for engaging in this conversation. Rather, this is me taking a moment to acknowledge our shared commitment to that conversation and what the organizers hope has been a series of presentations that provide source material as you continue these conversations long after the conclusion of this event. With that, I'll extend my personal appreciation that you've chosen to express your own commitment in this particular forum. Your presence today promises to make Professor Looser's presentation on the intersection between slavery and Jane Austen's own family the final success of many we've shared over the past few months. My own pandemic-ridden season has been enriched by this series, and I know that I speak for all of us when I say how, based on your presence and enthusiastic curiosity thus far, we are thrilled by the prospects of what a series like Race in the Regency has already achieved and can achieve beyond the confines of our formal programming. So thank you for joining us, and welcome back for this 10th and final event in Race in the Regency.
And my name's Inga Brody. I also want to welcome you. I'm director of the Jane Austen Summer Program, which is the umbrella organization, and as well as co-director and co-founder of this Jane Austen and Company. I want to thank Anne and Danielle very much for their hard work this semester, and in addition to all our wonderful speakers, and also just to thank the audience once again for joining us from afar, from all sorts of time zones. It has really been a treat. And as I may have shared before, Jane Austen and Company began as a small library outreach program that we had, where we were pleased when we reached maybe 15 or 20 people at a time, and now we're reaching hundreds at a time. So there definitely have been some wonderful silver linings to the difficulties that we all faced this past time. So let me, without any further ado, turn things over to our technical director. And then when she's done, I will introduce our wonderful speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Sfera. I am a doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I am your technical director for this evening. I'd like to take a moment to explain how tonight's event will work. The event will last about 90 minutes in total. Throughout and after the presentation, you are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. Inger, Danielle, and Anne will look in the Q&A box for your questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's both a chat and the Q&A box. So I see that many of us have already found the chat. You are welcome to chat there throughout the entire presentation, but for actual questions regarding the content of tonight's presentation, please put them in the Q&A box so they do not get lost in our robust chat. Now, if you've attended our events before, you know that we do have a robust chat. And if you want to hide the chat and chat notifications from your computer, we recommend pulling up the chat box, which you can do by clicking the little chat box and just pulling the actual box off screen. So put it in the corner, drag it down somewhere where you can't see it, and that way the notifications will stop popping up as well. If you are on, if you are on a tablet or another mobile device, what you can do is mute the chat. So please go ahead, again, open the chat box. Then you can click the little bell up in the right-hand corner, and that bell gives you the options to mute your notifications. Again, if you do that, you won't have the pop-ups, you won't see that there are multiple messages waiting for you to read in the chat. If you run into any technical difficulties, please feel free to send me a chat or send a chat to all the panelists, and I can do what I can to help. Thank you.
And thank you, Emily, so much for your help throughout this whole series and making things run smoothly. She's done a wonderful job. So it's my honor to introduce Devoney Looser, who is Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University. I've known Devoney for decades, I think, and she's the coolest Austen scholar that I know, among many other wonderful traits. And she has authored or edited 9 books, including Making of Jane Austen, The Making of Jane Austen, sorry, and The Daily Jane Austen, A Year in Quotes, as well as a series of 24 30-minute videos and audio lessons on Jane Austen for the Great Courses, which is quite an achievement. She's published essays in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Salon, TLS, and The Washington Post. With the support of a Guggenheim Fellowship and an NEH Public Scholar Award, Looser has completed a biography called Sister Novelists. Very excited to read this. Sister Novelists, Jane and Anna Marie Porter, to be published in 2022 by Bloomsbury, USA. So we're very delighted to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Inger. It's really lovely to be here. Just so grateful for this opportunity to be a part of this series of lectures to present alongside previous speakers, including Robert Morrison, Lyndon Dominique, Damian Scott, Danielle Christmas, Evie Zavoy, Patricia A. Matthew, Gretchen Gritzina, and Juliet Wells. And if you haven't seen all of those yet, I hope that you will go to the website and avail yourself of the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and it's going to take a moment to prepare those, but believe me, we should all be back without a hitch if this all goes off okay. So let's see this here.
And while Devoney is pulling that up, we want to mention that tonight's program will be recorded, so you will hear via our Facebook page and website when it's available to view.
Excellent. Okay, I hope this means it's all in order here and we're good to go. I'm going to be presenting tonight and on the subject of slavery, anti-slavery, and the Austen family. And I'm speaking to you today from Phoenix, Arizona, a land that's been inhabited for centuries by 22 native nations, including the Acumel, O'odham, Pima, and Peeposh Maricopa communities. And I want to acknowledge and honor the sovereignty of these nations and to let you know that I'm seeking to work with my employer, Arizona State University, to create an environment of success and possibility for Native American students. I'm so grateful to the co-organizers of the Race and the Regency series, and especially to Inger Brody, Danielle Christmas, and Fertig, and Emily Sfera for their vision and labor in making this possible, especially at this difficult and momentous moment in the history of public health and in the history of racial justice struggles. So I join those who believe that to address and solve these problems, we need to talk about them directly and to try to understand them historically. As Manu Chander and Patricia Matthew remind us, it should no longer be possible to read texts from the early 19th century without attending to the geopolitics of slavery, especially as it is reflected in diverse literary forms. So I have new information and a few little discoveries to share in this talk, and they're on the subject of the Austen family, slavery, and the anti-slavery movement. And much of this material will be appearing in print in this week's issue of the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, in the May 21st issue, which should be online in just a few hours. But I'm very glad to be able to share the highlights with you here first, and only afraid to tell you that I'm going to be starting slow and make you wait to hear these new details. If you decide that you do want to live tweet any of this, I'd be grateful if you'd be willing to tag me and the TLS. So I want to spend a few minutes trying to put us all on the same page about the conversation that we're having. My guess is that most of you in the audience know that Jane Austen has been in the news of late, thanks to a story about the Jane Austen Museum in Chawton that went viral in late April. It all started in the Daily Telegraph in its interview with the museum director, Lizzie Dunford, who revealed that the Jane Austen Museum's exhibits and signage were being updated to interrogate Austen's relationship to colonialism, slavery, the slave trade, and people of color. This news story, and especially that word interrogate, was picked up by the British tabloids and it was sensationalized. By the end of the week, headlines and coverage had spun off from the original article and had appeared on 5 continents. Again, I'm guessing most of you already know that. As you may also know, the Austen Museum then released a clarifying statement about what it was trying to do, and it described its goals to provide a more layered and nuanced presentation of Austen colonialism, slavery, and race. Many of you are probably here because, like me, you followed these recent conversations with interest or concern, and you want to know more. I honor you for that interest, and I hope you'll find some answers here, as well as that you'll find others to continue to discuss these issues with during and after this event. We need more readers and more of our collective Janeite fandom and Austen studies to turn close and careful attention to these issues. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how I come to this work, or rather the direction that my research comes at these questions from. I've been writing for several years now on Jane Austen's afterlife, siblings, and collateral descendants, with particular attention to politics, gender, and race. For instance, I published a work with Ruth Knezevich about Jane Austen's naval brother, Charles Austen, and his experience with a mixed-race businesswoman in the West Indies in the late 1820s. Those pieces appeared in the scholarly journal, Modern Philology, with a second piece written for a wider audience in Jane Austen's Regency World magazine. After that, in Jane Austen, in the making of Jane Austen and elsewhere, I shared research findings on Jane Austen's great nephew and family biographer, Lord Brabourne, and this brought to light information about his position against women's suffrage and about his changing political parties from Liberal to Tory as a member of Parliament in the 1880s, just at the time that he was publishing his great aunt's letters. After that, in the journal Victorians, I shared information about Austen's collateral descendants and the women's suffrage movement. I know fewer of you have probably seen this one. One Austen family member, a collateral descendant, signed a women's suffrage petition, and another at the same time was traveling the country advocating against women's gaining the right to vote. So these are continuing research projects for me and many of us as we seek to better understand the formation of Austen's celebrity and reputation. Now, I know that there are many people in this audience with considerable expertise about Austen's family and extended family, as well as some who are coming to this subject for the first time. So I'm going to try, if possible, to speak to both groups, at least in part. And I want to start with a caveat. When we make claims about Austen's family, we need to be very mindful of just how many people we're talking about at any particular moment in time. Jane Austen had 7 siblings. Among them, they had 33 children, her nieces and nephews. And one generation after that, the number had expanded to include 101 great nephews and great nieces. So one thing that I think we can say as a result of that, and that information is information I'm getting from Maggie Lane's book, but by the mid-19th century then, for any of us to be claiming that the Austen family thought or believed something, or didn't think or didn't believe something, is probably an exaggeration, if not an untruth. Those of us with complicated families of our own will probably have no trouble believing that many relatives are unlikely to be of one mind about anything. But I won't be considering Austen's extended family here. Instead, I'm turning to her immediate family, the members of her close family, namely her father and brothers. Now, recent news coverage invites us, I think even compels us to ask and answer some very direct and difficult questions about Austen and the history of race and racism. 2 of those questions might be posed as follows. What were Austen's attitudes towards slavery, the slave trade, and the abolition movement, and beyond that, all people of color in her day? And second, what were the Austen family's connections to slavery, slave trade, and the abolition movement, and beyond that, all people of color in their day. So attitudes and connections. I'm going to start with a brief overview of number one, even though I know that I don't have any new information to add. Then we'll move on to the second question, where I do have a few new facts that point to possible answers. So let's start with that first question, Austen's attitudes. I'm going to note just briefly where we find material in her fiction on issues of slavery and race. This seems important to do in part because there was a piece that appeared this week that you may have seen in the National Review, which claims that, quote, there is vanishingly little in Austen that touches on any issues of racial justice. Really only one stray line from Mansfield Park, says the writer of that piece. And that's simply not true. The direct material Austen includes on racial justice in her writings may not be extensive, but as those of us who read the novels carefully know, it's far more than one stray line. Now, the so-called stray line is perhaps her best known on the subject of slavery. It occurs in a conversation between heroine Fanny Price and hero Edmund Bertram in Mansfield Park. It's also a misunderstood section of this novel because it follows on from a very famous reading by the late Edward Said about the meaning of the phrase, or the meanings of the phrase, dead silence in this long passage I've quoted here, which again, I know is well known to many of you in the audience. You'll notice that it's not Sir Thomas Bertram, who has recently returned from Antiguan estates that he owns, presumably sugar plantations run on the labor of enslaved people. It's not Sir Thomas Bertram who's silent. It's some of his children who are silent. And this is often misinterpreted in discussions of this passage in the popular media. Said himself reads these ignorant, arrogant Bertram cousins' dead silence as equivalent to Austen's dead silence. But it's possible that this line of Fanny's is instead an indictment of privileged white people who ignore issues of racial injustice rather than a statement in support of that silence. The title of Mansfield Park, too, as I know is well known to many of you, has been much discussed and debated for its possible connection to Lord Mansfield in his 1772 ruling in the Somerset case, which said enslaved people couldn't be forcibly removed from Britain and sold into slavery. Now, there's also a reference to the institution of slavery in Emma. It's a controversial message among critics, scholars, because in it, Jane Fairfax suggests that being an educated, genteelly poor white governess in Britain is similar to being an enslaved person in West Indies. She's making a comparison, and that was then a common trope. But there is no reading of this conversation that ought to lead us to see it as endorsing what Jane Fairfax calls the sale of human flesh. It directly references the guilt of those who carry on that practice, meaning either slavery, the slave trade, or both. Now, we all know too, I believe, on this call, that there is a specific mention of a person of color in Austen's fiction. She included the mixed race heiress, Miss Lamb, in her unfinished and unpublished last work, Sanderson, from 1817. Miss Lamb's character, known to many of you from the 2019 ITV Sanderson series, recently renewed. In the Sanderson series, the character is known as Georgiana, but in the original unfinished text, she doesn't have any dialogue and doesn't yet have a first name. I should just back up to reiterate what is well known among scholars, which is it's estimated that in London in the late 18th century, there were between 10,000 and 30,000 Black servants of African descent. And these were joined by countless Black sailors, students, musicians, and all sorts of refugees, including a number of soldiers on both sides of the American Revolutionary conflict. It's estimated by Gretchen Gertzina that as many as 20% of soldiers on both sides of that conflict were Black. There were also an increasing number of authors and intellectuals. And if you haven't read Gertzina's Black London, it is freely available for download, and I highly, highly recommend that you do that. Also, you could watch her talk in this series. Other scholars you've heard from in this lecture series are revisiting and revising these accounts and investigating literary representations of people of color. There is still so much to learn and so much left to know. I especially recommend to you Victoria Baugh's essay on Sanderson's Miss Lamb, which appeared in the European Romantic Review. Now, it's true that there isn't much of a mention of slavery and the slave trade in Austen's surviving letters. The number of letters of hers that survives is just 161 out of the likely thousands that she's estimated to have written in her lifetime. But in one of those surviving letters, Austen writes about having been much in love with the author Thomas Clarkson. This is meaningful because Clarkson was a pioneering abolitionist who dedicated his life to ending slavery. So Austen could be referring here to one of Clarkson's works or to his entire body of work. He was a prolific author of political pamphlets, at least 23 of them, beginning in the late 1780s. And in 1808, he published a 2-volume history of the rise, progress, and accomplishment of the abolition of the African slave trade by the British Parliament. Now, that work focuses almost exclusively on the humanitarian work of white men, and it largely leaves out accounts of brutality toward enslaved people. But taken together, this information does point to Jane Austen's awareness of, study of, and concern about issues of race, gender, and politics and economics in her day. It doesn't give us a lot of information to go on to describe her personal beliefs, and it raises a lot of questions. And perhaps that's why so many scholars have for so long turned to her family to try to understand the context in which she wrote about these matters. So that brings us back to question number 2. What were the Austen family's connections to slavery, the slave trade, and the abolition or anti-slavery movement, and beyond that, all people of color? The very last part of that question continues to be difficult to grasp for the Austens. But the first parts of that question have been addressed by researchers for more than 50 years. A chief among people trying to address those questions was the late Deirdre Lafayette. No one in Austen's studies in the 20th century was more tireless and careful in this work. No one spent more years and amassed more facts on Austen and her family than Deirdre, who died on August 16th, 2020 at the age of 86. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to share with you some Austen family facts that aren't in Deirdre's 779-page chronology, which is pictured here. On a personal note, I'd like to add too that I owe a debt to Deirdre. In the years before she died, she kindly and generously entered into email exchanges with me, and I know with many of us, about the need for continued research on the Austens. Across her lifetime, Deirdre compiled some 10,000 note cards with facts about the Austen family. She donated her papers, her notebooks, her archive to the fabulous Chawton House, which just reopened yesterday. And I regret very much that Deirdre is no longer here to serve as a sounding board for new Austen archival discoveries, but I'm grateful that her papers remain there for future access. I did, however, in the course of working on this talk, have the good fortune to be able to consult with other experts in legal and colonial history, and many generously offered their time and knowledge. And I want to note especially the invaluable help that I had in recent weeks from Patricia Matthew, Peter Saber, and John Avery Jones. I'm incredibly grateful for their wisdom and expertise. So, on to the subject of the Austen family, slavery, and anti-slavery. Let's start with what you might have read previously. Rev George Austin was the trustee, or in some accounts, the principal or sole trustee of an Antiguan sugar plantation. This is how the Daily Telegraph reported it. In 1760, 15 years before Jane Austen began the sugar plantation of his Oxford University friend, James Nibs. The Telegraph reports, if Nibs had died early, Reverend Austen would have been responsible for the plantation and its slaves. Now, this statement is partly true and partly false, as I'll explain in a moment. The Antiguan sugar plantation, which Austen served as a trustee, deed owned by Langford Nibs, whose family across generations amassed its wealth through the forced labor of enslaved people. That Reverend George Austen was connected to James Langford Nibs and his family has long been known, although Austen and Nibs' connections to each other turn out to run more deep than we formerly thought. The fact of James Langford Nibs and George Austen's connection to each other is included in the important and freely available database, Legacies of British Slave Ownership. This database, which was constructed about a decade ago, is well known in the UK. It's perhaps less well known in other places, and if you haven't yet done so, I encourage you to look at it. The database is a project of the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery at the University College London, led by Professor Catherine Hall. The project estimates that between 10 and 20% of Britain's wealthy from this era may be identified as having had significant economic links to slavery. This number would presumably include Nibs. It would not include Austin, whose ties to Nibs and Antigua did not bring him a direct income. For the past 50 years, scholars have set out to document and make sense of the Austin-Nibs friendship, especially because of the Nibs' connections to Antigua, a place so central to the plot of Mansfield Park. Now, the Reverend George Austin is said to have first met James Langford Nibs at St. John's College, Oxford, where he may have served as the younger man's teacher, tutor, mentor, or proctor. At Oxford, George Austin is said to have gained the nickname the Handsome Proctor to distinguish him from the other proctor at St. John's, who had a reputation as the more strict disciplinarian of the two men. Now, as you can see from these records, student James Langford Nibs arrived at St. John's College at age 19 in November 1758. George Austin, who'd been a fellow and a chaplain there, became proctor in 1759. He took his third Oxford degree, a Bachelor of Divinity degree, which is a postgraduate degree, in 1760. Although the two men, Austin and Nibs, overlapped at Oxford, they maintained ties to each other long afterward. And we've known this too. We've known that after George Austin married Cassandra Lee, moved to Steventon as its clergyman, and started a family, the Austins made James Langford Nibs the godfather of their eldest son, James. Some years later, Nibs sent his second son, George, to be educated by the Reverend George Austin at the small school that he ran out of his home, the rectory where Jane Austen grew up. It's even been speculated that George Nibs and James Austin may each have been named after their father's friend. The Austin siblings would have grown up knowing a next generation Nibs. There was apparently a portrait of a Mr. Nibs, or a portrait that went by that nickname, whether seriously or in jest, in the Austin household. We know about this picture from a brief reference to it in Jane's letters. But it's not accurate to say that the Reverend George Austin was either a principal or a sole trustee for an Antiguan sugar plantation, or that he would ever have been made responsible for running that plantation. He was instead a co-trustee in a marriage settlement that involved the dispersal of the plantation's land and profits. As you can see in the secondary record of the agreement, George Austin pledged to serve as one of two trustees named to ensure the conveyance of the plantation to Nibs' heir or heirs, along with a 50-pound annuity to Nibs' wife, who was born Barbara Langford. Now, Barbara Langford was Nibs' first cousin and an heiress of 10,000 pounds. These were wealthy people whose family drew on the legal system and the institution of marriage to consolidate its colonial wealth. George Austin, as Nibs' co-trustee, must have understood that he was being asked to play a role in extracting the family's Antiguan sugar plantation and its ill-begotten profits for his friend and his friend's wife, as well as their anticipated future heir. What has gone unnoticed until now is that the Reverend George Austin may have been named as a co-trustee in this marriage settlement for a very particular reason. George Austin was a clergyman who married James Langford Nibs and Barbara Langford at St. Clement Danes Church in London on February 12, 1760. This newly unearthed fact matters because it shows an even closer connection between the Nibs and the Austins beyond their known school ties in Oxford. It was the only wedding that George Austin performed at that London church that year. And if you feel as if you may have heard the name St. Clement's before, it's because in Pride and Prejudice, Lydia Bennet reports that she was married to Wickham at a St. Clement's. Now, without going too deep into the weeds of this trusteeship, let me point your attention to a further significant fact. The co-trustee who served alongside Reverend George Austin in Nibs' marriage settlement is also a historically important person. Morris Robinson held a position in the sixth clerk's office in the Court of Chancery. And this is important for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that Morris Robinson was the more experienced of the two co-trustees. As a solicitor, Robinson would have also been highly familiar with marriage settlements. Morris Robinson, not George Austin, would have been selected as a co-trustee by the Nibs family for his expertise and experience with the law and estate management. Now, Morris Robinson is also a fascinating person to be able to tie to the Austen family. That's because he was the brother of Elizabeth Robinson Montagu, known then as the Queen of the Bluestockings. She was one of the most important figures in British women's intellectual circles in the 18th century. A scholar and critic of Shakespeare, Montagu was a supporter of the arts and led a salon out of her home. Elizabeth Montagu's husband made his money through owning coal mines, incidentally. Elizabeth Montagu was close to her older brother, Morris. One of Morris's sons was eventually informally adopted by her after she was widowed. And it's been previously known that the Austins and the extended Robinson family had social ties through a few references to the Robinsons in Austen's letters. But it was assumed that these ties came through a more distant path from Elizabeth Montagu. George Austen's 1760 connection to Morris Robinson through Nibs puts the Austins in closer social proximity to the Bluestocking circle than has been formally thought. For our purposes here, however, it's more important to recognize that Morris Robinson's work at the Sixth Clerk's office locates him just blocks away from St. Clement Danes, where the Nibs' wedding was performed. It was customary then for marriage settlements to be finalized before the wedding. This was one that was said to have been drawn up on the 8th and 9th of February, 1760, so just 3 days before the ceremony was performed. Such agreements also regularly, conventionally named at least 2 trustees. So knowing this might expand the ways that we imagine George Austen's becoming a co-trustee for these complicit in slavery assets. It's possible that he was asked to serve in this role because he was there with the couple at the time that the contract was drawn up. Now, of course, Austen could have refused to serve in this way, and he didn't. He could have cut close ties with Nibs at any point afterwards, and he doesn't seem to have. But the idea that George Austen in 1760 would have imagined himself signing on to manage a West Indian sugar plantation if Nibs should die exaggerates his role. It also fails to capture the complexity of this responsibility. Under a strict settlement, the plantation was settled in the name of the life tenant, who had full powers to manage it. It was not in the name of the trustees. A recent op-ed about George Austen mistakenly assumes that the trustee was a job that George Austen held before he was a clergyman. That's certainly not the case. Others have assumed that trustee was a position that either did or might require him to live, work, and or manage an estate in the West Indies and derive profits from it. And it wasn't that either. What Morris and George Austen would have understood is that their duties as co-trustees meant transferring the plantation's ownership from Nibs to his heir or heirs. That was the expectation and boundary of their work within the terms of the settlement. George Austen was legally implicated then in conveying the ownership of a plantation estate in Antigua for a former student and continuing friend. Robinson and Austen, as co-trustees, would not have been responsible for managing the Antiguan estate itself. In fact, in later years, when Nibs's financial and familial situation became far more complicated, Nibs directly assigned management of the plantation to another man. Now, the Reverend George Austen's entanglement with Nibs does seem to have had an effect on Jane's fiction writing. The Nibs family ended up having conflicts that likely influenced the plot of Mansfield Park, as previous scholars have noted. The fate of James Langford Nibs and his son, who was also named James Langford Nibs, closely resembles that of Sir Thomas Bertram and his wastrel son, Tom Bertram. Both young men, real and imagined, went deeply into debt. Both the real man and the imagined one dug into the family fortunes as each father took steps to put a halt to the son's extravagances and to protect the family's Antiguan plantation fortunes. In neither case, the real or the fictional, does one come away feeling much sympathy for the morally corrupt colonial rich. This is not the end of the story by any means. More facts and interpretations about the Austens and the Nibses must continue to emerge and will no doubt be better described by those with expertise in the history of English and Antiguan property law, as well as in colonialism and the history of slavery. Just last week, an excellent op-ed appeared in the Washington Post that made reference to previous scholars' claims that the Nibs family of Antigua had among its members mixed race relatives. This is a claim that's made in the previous scholarship too, and it certainly deserves further research. I look forward to reading any information unearthed about these Nibs family members. In the meantime, what we can learn more from is the Austen family's evolving attitude towards slavery and the slave trade through the lives and works of Jane Austen's brothers once they entered adulthood. Now, so far, most of the research into Austen's siblings and the questions of slavery and the slave trade have concentrated on Francis and Charles Austen, dubbed Jane Austen's sailor brothers, who both built successful careers in the Royal Navy. The Navy became central to the policing of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807. Now, of course, outlawing something, policing it, and stopping it do not necessarily go hand in hand within or beyond national borders. There surely would have been British naval and military officers who didn't support or actively enforce the new law. The Austen brothers, however, do not seem to have been among them. Charles is said to have been chiefly involved in suppressing the slave trade in the West Indies for 2 years, from 1826 to 28. It wasn't until several years later, in 1833, that slavery was nominally abolished in the British colonies. It's important to note, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around this point, but it's important to note that the 1833 Emancipation Act provided, in fact, a very slow transition, which subjected formerly enslaved people to what turned out to be, in many cases, up to 5 more years of so-called apprenticeship or indentured servitude. Only children under 6 were made immediately free in 1833. At the same time, former so-called owners of enslaved people were compensated by the British government. And the amount of compensation ranged from £6 for a child, £50 for a field worker, and up to £100 for a skilled laborer. So men were said to be worth more than women. And again, these were amounts that were paid to slavers. The payments to 3,000 families amounted to £20 million, which is said to be the equivalent of £16 billion today. And this amount was paid then by British taxpayers. The enslaved people themselves received no compensation. The legacy of the British slave ownership project, that I mentioned earlier, set out to document which British individuals and families received payments and how much. Now, Jane Austen died in 1817, 16 years before the Emancipation Act, but she did live during the debates that led up to the 1807 Act to abolish the slave trade. And it's important to note that then and afterward, even abolitionists weren't of the same mind. They weren't of one mind about what the future of colonial slavery should be. And again, to turn to historian Gretchen Gertzina, you heard from earlier in this series, she reminds us that those who believed in racial justice in this area didn't necessarily believe in racial equality. And by the same token, those who believed in abolishing the slave trade didn't necessarily believe in abolishing colonial slavery. In Francis Austen's case, what we have evidence of is that he believed that colonial slavery itself, not only the slave trade, ought to be abolished. Francis recorded his disgust with slavery in his unpublished private diaries. It was quoted in an Austen family biography as long ago as 1906. Francis wrote there, he wrote and it was quoted there, "Slavery, however it may be modified, is still slavery. And it is much to be regretted that any trace of it should be found to exist in countries dependent on England or colonized by her subjects." So Francis's statement made circa 1808 goes further than English law did then. Now, these things have long been known of in Austen studies, but it turns out that Francis and Charles Austen were not the only brothers whose work and words took a stand against the institution of slavery. What hasn't been previously noted is that another of Jane Austen's brothers, Henry Thomas Austen, became publicly involved in the anti-slavery movement. He is best known to us now as a failed banker turned clergyman who became in 1818 his sister Jane's first biographer. As you can see here, the Reverend HT Austin, as he was then calling himself, served as a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, organized by the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, held in London from June 12th to 23rd, 1840. This was more than 2 decades after Jane's death, and 7 years after slavery was on a slow path to being dismantled in the British colonies. Henry Austin was one of two delegates representing Colchester, where he was then living. He had just turned 69 the previous week. What this means is that Henry Thomas Austin had become by 1840 an anti-slavery activist. This is a fact that's not noted in any of the Austin biographies or chronologies and seems not to have been previously noticed in our scholarship. There's an excellent biography on Henry by Emma Cleary, and it is not in that biography either. The Reverend HT Austin of Colchester was delegate number 92. He traveled 66 miles to London to sit among the nearly 500 delegates who had traveled from around the world to seek an end to slavery across the globe. There were also 5,000 visitors there over the convention's 9 days. A secondary charge of the group was, as it paternalistically put it, to watch over the infant liberties of the emancipated Negroes in the British colonies. Now, as this line may suggest, the World Anti-Slavery Convention is now rightly seen as having been a problematic, if important and historic gathering. Its work did not run smooth. The convention prevented the 8 white women sent as delegates from America from being officially seated as delegates on the floor with the men. Just a handful of Black men, many of them described as liberated slaves, were so seated. The facts of this convention continue to be documented and interpreted, even interrogated by historians, and that's absolutely as it should be. A famous painting by history painter Benjamin Robert Hayden immortalized the work of this convention. It includes 130 figures and provides a key to them by name. Henry Austin's name and face weren't among these figures. Hayden, who'd never been to a convention like this before, described the overwhelming emotional experience of attending this gathering. He sketched 52 heads and 5 days and wrote of the experience, "This convention has affected me deeply. Too many heads, too remarkable diversity." Hayden saw the experience with one particular set of eyes, but the image he created provides visual clarity about the exclusions based on race and sex found within the 19th century anti-slavery movement too. What's interesting to consider for our purposes is that as a delegate, Henry Austin would have heard the address of the convention's frail elderly president, Thomas Clarkson, the pioneering abolitionist whose writings his sister Jane had once admired. Henry doesn't appear to have spoken at this convention, although he did have a reputation by then for excellent public speaking. According to an 1826 brief report in the London Times, the Reverend HT Austin delivered sermons of great eloquence and animation in a style that was said to rouse fellow clergy, families of the first distinction, farmers, and the poor alike. Now, no matter how much Henry, or how little Henry contributed to the work of the convention in 1840, his presence there as a delegate is notable today. 80 years after the Reverend George Austin, his father, signed on as a co-trustee to convey the ownership and proceeds of an Antiguan plantation in a marriage settlement, the Reverend Henry Thomas Austin, as a next generation Austin, publicly declared a political commitment to abolish slavery across the globe and to try to support formerly enslaved people. So what's now possible to understand with this new information is that Austin's beloved brother Henry, oh, what a Henry, Jane once said of him, did not in the end sit idly by in the face of racial injustice. One may rightly say that it took too long for someone from the Austen family to stake out such a public position. It's also true that it took us too long, for those of us who study literature in a social context, to notice this fact. These newly unearthed facts about Austen's family ought to serve as a wake-up call for readers today. Those readers who might resist reading Jane Austen's fiction in the context of race and political action have some new things, I think, to think about with these facts. The years 1760 to 1840 were transformational for the history of British colonialism, slavery, and anti-slavery in terms of laws, activism, literature, visual representations, and popular opinion. It stands to reason that the Austen family's politics would have changed too over the course of those years. We can't know for certain the extent to which Jane Austen shared the opinion of her father or brothers during this half of the period during which she was alive. But this new information demonstrates that it's fitting to bring political questions and questions of race and racial justice to Austen's fiction because they were a central part of her time and indeed of her immediate family's lives. If you leave with one takeaway point here from this lecture, I hope it's this. If we're asked to determine whether the Austen family was pro-slavery or anti-slavery, then the best answer to that reductive and simplistic, but nevertheless understandable question is both. From the information we've long known, as well as the new information we've looked at together here, it's evident that we ought not to selectively choose our facts. More of us who care about Austen and the literature of this era need to be willing to openly explore and consider issues of colonialism, slavery, anti-slavery, race, and racism. There are a lot of great books to read. There are also ways to support and amplify the voices of those who've long been doing this work in institutions and organizations that haven't previously been inclusive, diverse, or welcoming enough to people of color. Scrutinizing the Regency past, Jane Austen's fiction, and the history of the Austen family ought to prompt a reckoning in fandoms, readerships, and organizations, as well as produce more honest and accurate museum exhibits. Again, I want to say thank you to the previous speakers, to the organizers of this series, and to all of you for being here. I hope to stay connected to you. I look forward to your comments and questions next. I will do my best to answer them or to point you to someone who can. And I want to end my formal remarks with a final call to action. More of us in the Janeite community and beyond it need to be willing to use our voices to seek betterment and change. I hope you'll take a moment this week to tell the institutions and organizations that you affiliate with about the kinds of work that you'd like to see done now and next to further diversity, equity, and inclusion. As we reread Austen's fiction and learn more about her family's legacy in the history of slavery, we should challenge ourselves to name things out loud, to engage in what historian Catherine Hall calls undoing the forgetting, or what novelist Toni Morrison describes as remembering. Perhaps what Jane Austen's narrator in Northanger Abbey had to say about heroines and novel writing might also apply here too. Let us not desert one another. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devoney. That was fascinating. And I think everyone here will agree when I say that was just a fantastic talk.
Thank you,
To
Anne.
everyone in the audience, there's still time to drop your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen as we're going to begin asking questions now. And I'm going to start off with a question because I was really excited to hear about this new discovery of yours. And I'm wondering, how did you find this out? What was the process of discovery, or what clues you in to looking at the World Anti-Slavery Convention?
So the first thing I need to start by saying is, because I work at a university, I have access to commercial databases that not everyone has access to. So that's already a leg up that those of us who are affiliated with research universities and these databases have that people who are not don't have. So I definitely benefited from those. But I also used some freely available databases too. And what led to, I didn't know I was going to find that, obviously, but what led to finding things was I realized that Henry Thomas Austen was going by the Rev HT Austin. And once I realized that, I started really digging down into the various databases I have access to. And I spelled it all sorts of different ways because sometimes the optical character recognition doesn't catch the thing in exactly the way you wanted to catch it. I also want to acknowledge that I had training in archival research that was supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities in a summer seminar in 1994 that was led by Professor Paula Backscheider, and met a lot of colleagues there who continued to be important to me. I think at least one of them might be on this call, Catherine and Gracia. So these are people I have continued to have research experiences with and learn from. And it was learning how to triangulate those kinds of sources and information that led to finding the Henry Austen. And then I just needed to scramble and make sure that he was actually in Colchester in 1840, which Deidre Lafayette's work does allow us to confirm.
Thank you for that. We have a question about the brothers. Is that there any record of the Austen family's attitude towards the Palmer family as slaveholders? Would it be accurate to guess that Charles Austen was not as deliberately anti-slavery as his brother Francis?
So your best source on that is Sheila Johnson Kindred's book on the Austen, on Fanny Palmer Austen. And I know if I had that in front of me, I could look that up for you and see the extent to which she talks about that. But I would say the title of it, okay, Jane Austen's Transatlantic, is it Jane Austen's Transatlantic Sister? Is that
Yes.
the title? Thank you. Thank you very much. Was having trouble pulling that one off the top of my head. And I think your question about Charles is a really interesting one. I have some ongoing work about Charles. So I'm only going to say a little bit about that here, which is that he certainly, like his brother Francis, had daily and interpersonal and visual experiences with people who were slavers as well as with enslaved people. And so I think to say Charles might have had more, he encountered populations of people later in his adult life, and I would say possibly had less sympathies than Francis, possibly. How about that? It's a great question. I don't know that I would put it down to his marriage necessarily as having caused that. I think that's possible. I don't think the Palmers were all that wealthy. If Sheila Johnson Kindred, if her work, if I'm remembering it correctly, but I think that's a great question. There are other better experts out there on that for you than I am, and I hope you'll chase them down. But maybe someone else will find us a faster answer to that, or maybe that's going on in the chat right now too. I certainly hope so.
A question about the Hayden painting and what it implies. Certainly there were many important women involved in the in abolition and abolitionist writings, yet there seemed to be very few women in this painting. It seems like there's a little fringe of women on both the left and the right. What do you know anything about whether women were encouraged, discouraged from attending this?
I do, and this is a question that's been taken up in the study of this painting, as well as in the study of this event, the convention. There were apparently 8 white females who were coming from America to be seated as delegates and were not allowed to be seated. There were visitors who are not delegates who are in that painting. And Benjamin Robert Hayden decided to put them closer in because some of them are famous. So Lady Byron, for instance, is one of the women depicted there, along with Amelia Opie. And so he put them closer in. And if you go to the National Portrait Gallery's website, where this painting lives, you can see a key to all of those people. You can see the painting itself. You'll learn a lot of information about Hayden's construction of this painting. But it was on the first day that the white women who arrived learned that they would not be seated. They had a vote and decided not to seat the white women. Lucretia Mott was one of the famous, she came from Philadelphia. She was one of the famous American delegates who wrote in her diary about not being seated. And William Lloyd Garrison, an American delegate, refused to join the other delegates on the floor and chose to sit with the women who were not allowed to sit on the floor. So there is a lot of controversy, obviously, about that, and a lot of commentary on it too. The commentary on the people of color in the painting, just to add to that, you will see that there is a Black man in the front of the painting. He has been identified as Henry Beckford, a quote unquote liberated slave. And it is believed, although I think not definitively established, that he may have been a relative of William Beckford, the novelist of Vathek, and from that Beckford family, which were also slavers.
Thank you.
Early on, you showed us a copy of Clarkson's work. Do you know if there's a copy of that in her brother's library, and that, possibly she might have read that copy, or is that unknown?
Somebody please look that up on Peter Saber's wonderful.
It's not listed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ingrid, for being right there for that one for me. So it's speculated that that's the work she was referring to, I think because she makes the point about Clarkson in 1813, and that was the most recently published one. So in the scholarship I've seen, it suggests that it's probably this 2-volume work that she's talking about. And she talks about it alongside works by military men and Christian activists. So it's a part of a letter where she's talking about men who she finds attractive through their writing. And I think that's really fascinating. You know, a lot more obviously could be said there, but I'm not sure specifically that we know that there is a copy of that in a library. And if it's not there, Inger,
It's not on Peter Saber's site. Yeah.
And Peter Saber's the Reading with Austin site, which is a fabulous site. And if your listeners, if the audience doesn't know about that one, you know, somebody should definitely throw that into the chat too. And you should play around with that beautiful, beautiful site, which is just an incredible fund of information.
We have a few questions that connect to the really interesting and fair question about whether Jane met Black people, right? So is it likely or possible that she ran into Black people in London? Somebody mentioned Equiano in particular. Is it possible that she crossed paths with Equiano, or would she have known his work?
I think it's harder to answer a particular person. And since we know that Jane Austen did not necessarily engage in hanging out with literary lions, I guess is what we would have called them at the time, right? With the literati. She seems to have avoided gatherings like that, according to Henry, in any case, when he revised his memoir of her in 1833, he suggests that she had a chance to meet Madame de Stael and turned it down. And he seems to say that it's because she didn't want to be out and known as an author in a public setting. So I think to say that she met someone like Equiano would probably be less likely given that fact that we know about her. To say that she saw people of color, absolutely. And you know, this is, Gretchen Gertzina is really your best source on this. Please go download that book and read it if you have not yet. The fact that she's made it freely available is just so generous, and it is such a readable, brilliant, beautiful book. So I highly recommend that to you. But she goes through and describes in the first chapter, if you just read just the first chapter of that book, please read more, but it describes what it would have been like to be on a London street in the late 18th century and what one might have saw. And I've seen documents from around the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention more recently, Americans who came back to the United States and wrote about their experience in being in London in 1840 and the number of people of color they saw holding hands with white people in places like Hyde Park, the people Black people they saw getting in and out of public of hackney coaches and other kinds of transportation. So Americans coming back to say, here are Black people living on a kind of you know, equal footing is overstating it, but that's what the Americans were trying to sell to their country men and women in describing what they were seeing in Britain. So that's 20 years after Austen, but I think that we can assume with 10 to 20,000 servants alone countable in London in this period, that when she went to see her brother Henry, other times that she was staying in London, she absolutely would have had daily encounters with Black people and all people of color, because it was a multiracial, multi-ethnic city. And so, you know, this is something that I know a number of scholars and Janeites have been trying to say to us, that it's not going back to the past and adding in something that you know wasn't there. This was part of the racial makeup and reality of this time. The exact numbers, you know, 10 to 20,000 and a city of 600,000, it's not huge, but statistically likely that she would have had interactions with Black people, if that answers the question. And again, I'm sure that there are people in the chat who can add to that and enrich our sense of what I'm describing, but that's my understanding from the scholarship. I have not done primary research on that. What I know is through reading the secondary scholarship.
A question from one of our participants. You this is very helpful regarding anti-slavery sentiment in Austin's close family. What are your thoughts about not conflating anti-slavery with anti-racism?
Yes.
Many abolitionists were still hierarchical in their views about race and didn't question whiteness as superiority.
Absolutely. That is just beautifully put. And I think you're right that we can't conflate them. Absolutely can't. And most of the anti-slavery movement talks about people of color in ways that are infantilizing, in ways that sound surprised by intellectual equality. There are lots of things in the discourse as you read the rhetoric of this era that you will notice from a 2021 perspective that an 1840 perspective or an 1807 white perspective might not have been very conscious of or cognizant of. But I think the way that Gertzina puts it, that we should not conflate racial injustice with racial equality. These didn't necessarily go together. And I think we can say the same too about class and the ways that class was talked about. Christianity has a really interesting role to play in making sense of this. Saying everyone was God's child, we're all God's children, didn't mean that there shouldn't still be poor people, right? This was not, this is something from the Anti-Slavery Convention itself. There was a question about how to talk about slavery in churches, whether slavers should be prevented from being in communion in a church. And the convention in 1840 could not decide whether they wanted to dictate against slavery or recommend against, dictate against slavers receiving communion or recommend that it be considered a sin. Was it dictated as a sin or recommended as a sin? That's interesting in itself. Sorry, I'm getting excited about this stuff.
Yeah.
We've got a couple people asking about the Knight family and what we know about their connections to slavery.
So I think the person that you would want to ask about that is Linda Slaughter, who's done a very extensive research into the Knight archives. My understanding from her work and the little I've read is that most of the wealth in the Knight family was from English land owning. I don't think you can say any family in this era that was wealthy didn't have some implication or interaction in terms of West Indian profits of some kind. I mean, obviously it's a connected economic system, but my understanding is that the Knight family, they were mostly, they had large English estates and that most of their wealth, and it was, I think in Linda's book, it looks like anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 pounds a year is what Edward Knight was clearing in those early 19th century years from his English estates. And if Linda's on this call, she could add to that, but I don't know.
Have you looked at the listings of the members in the Anti-Slavery Society to see if there were any other Austin members?
I don't believe there were any other Austin members at that convention. I can tell you that the person who Henry likely traveled with from Colchester was a man named Thomas Catchpool, who was a Quaker. And so this Colchester is a place where Henry Austin was because his second wife, Eleanor Jackson, had family in the Colchester area. And so he'd retired as perpetual curate in Bentley and headed off to Colchester, presumably because some of his wife's Jackson family relatives were there. How exactly he got involved in the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, I don't know, but presumably he traveled with Catchpool. And so that would be another really interesting connection to explore and learn more about. But I have not gone carefully through the list to see if there are others that we can tie in from these 500 delegates to Henry Thomas Austin. I hope someone will follow up on that.
Just on that tiny little snippet you gave us, which is very little to judge from, but it seemed like there were approximately 2 delegates from each location and that one was Esquire and the other was Reverend for the most part. So, I mean, was there any kind of standard that they tried to have a clergyman and a member of the legal profession from each location? Did you notice anything like that? Or more about the selection process?
I don't know. I think from my understanding, each area could send two, and that was probably up to the local society to decide how to do that. But I don't know of any dictate coming from the national, international organizations who said who could and couldn't be a delegate. Obviously, the British delegates were all male, so that tells you something. I think the New York delegation refused to send females. It was the Philadelphia and the Massachusetts delegations that said we want women to go. So that's what leads me to believe that it might have been internationally up to the area or the chapter. But this is moving into now into some material where I learned from the secondary scholarship, but I don't have primary research answers to give you. Again, if somebody knows the answer to that, please put that in the chat for us. And I really do hope that there will be more research from an Austen studies perspective into these questions now that we know about this Austen studies link.
Thank you. Danielle?
We have a really interesting question from a reader about Sanderson. Do you think that Miss Lamb from Sanderson might have been Austen's attempt to include the West Indian into English society? Could the name Lamb, which we associate with whiteness, be a way of making her palatable for English readers?
I think there's been a lot of amazing and important commentary on that name Lamb. And, I can tell you, I associate it more with William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience and Lamb from a Christian perspective. But obviously the blackness or whiteness of lambs, of a lamb, is not incidental. And I think there is a lot that could be done with the signification there. I'm not sure whether we should wish that Austen had continued to write Miss Lamb, or if we would be very sad to see what she'd done with her. I think it's hard to say, but I think the fact that the story seems to be leading toward in some way making her a sacrificial lamb does seem to be likely from the way she's introduced and from what we know of her other stories. The way that she is described as half mulatto, which is the phrase that Austen uses, Victoria Baugh's work has looked very closely into the mixed race heiress and mixed race heroines from this period, and has found that the use of the phrase half mulatto is very rare. And there is speculation about that and whether that seems to be racially progressive or racially conservative. And I can see arguments on both sides of that, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. We actually have a few questions about the role of women of color in music and the contributions of women of color to music, where folks can look to find out more about that or what you know about that.
Wow. So Gertzina, I mentioned musicians because Gertzina mentions it. I think that was the section where she talked about 18th century. I think her examples are mostly male, Black male musicians who were making a living in London, sort of entertainment industry figures in London. I do not have a good source for you on early 19th century Black women musicians. I hope whoever asked that question is going to do that work, or again, this would be a moment for someone in the audience who has more expertise than I do to put that out there for us or point us to a place. I do not know of a lot of work on that subject, and that could just be my ignorance.
So a couple of jumping around again, but a couple of questions about film adaptations and these issues. Whether you have any particular thoughts on the 1999 Rosima Mansfield Park, and it's much more explicit implications and graphic illustrations of slavery, whether you think this was a good choice or not for that film. And then a related question on whether more diverse casting would be appropriate in Jane Austen adaptations. You just wanted to reflect on those issues.
Can I start with the second one first, which is that absolutely color conscious and colorblind casting absolutely needed in Austen adaptations. And I know Bianca Hernandez in Book Hoarding and in Virtual JaneCon has been talking about this, and I hope you'll go pay attention to Virtual JaneCon and the videos that she's collected and her commentary on this. She's been
here, I think she's here tonight, I believe.
Bianca's been talking about this very convincingly, passionately, and I listen to and follow her on this subject absolutely. And I mean, I just think that's absolutely right. So to turn that to the question of the Patricia Rozema 1999 Mansfield Park, which I haven't rewatched and really ought to, but what I'm grateful for that film for doing is turning a spotlight post-Said on these issues of colonialism and slavery as not incidental, but quite central texts, subtexts, however you want to describe them in that story. Some of the choices that she makes, I am not sure I see as 100% fitting with the characterizations that Austen gives us, but that doesn't mean they're not really interesting and that they aren't possible. So I think what I'm grateful for in that film is that it puts us imaginatively in a different headspace for imagining Fanny Price, for imagining Sir Thomas Bertram, and for imagining the difference between the context of a West Indian sugar plantation and an English country house, and to see the ways that those two scenes have very different but very intertwined economic, racial, and violent connections.
Thank you.
So we have some people who are interested in your research on HT Austin, and whether or not you found any other interesting references to him. For example, you mentioned a news report about his preaching in 1926. Can you tell us when and where that was and why they were still talking about him, presumably well after his death?
Well, his death wasn't until 1850, so he was still very much alive in 1826. You mean after Jane's death? Is that what the question was? So Henry Thomas Austen and Mrs. Henry Austen, I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, were both publishing writing. So for him to be mentioned in the Times for a sermon that he delivered, he was a public figure. After we imagine him in the 18 teens, I think, as this failed banker, and that was a really important, and Emma Cleary makes very clear, important to Jane Austen's fiction, important to the Austen family moment, and his connections to the banking world, incredibly formative. But he went on to have this other set of experiences as a writer and publishing sermons, and his wife publishing these children's books, in effect, kind of catechism, spiritual children books. So the children's literature. So I think that the question of why he would be in the newspaper, he was still a public figure. So he was in the Times because he delivered an interesting lecture and somebody wrote it up, or also possible, somebody from the family wrote it up as a puff of him. So hard to say. Things got in the newspapers in all sorts of ways then.
Devoney, you are fantastic at something us academics often aren't, which is having an amazing website. So I think all of us, we unfortunately have to wrap up the Q&A, but if you could share your website in chat, I know that a lot of questions connected to your next projects, where to find more information. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone in the audience, especially folks who contributed questions. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to use the mic holder's prerogative. I'd like to alert you to one means of continuing this essential inquiry into race in the Regency. Jane Austen Society of North America's journal, Persuasion Online, is publishing a special issue later this year that concerns precisely the issues that we've collectively worked on over the course of this series. As a co-editor of this issue, I'm admittedly predisposed to believe our catalog of essays equals the quality of our presentations here. And I invite you to sign up for the email newsletter so you can be notified when it comes out and test me, see if that's true. We have some fantastic pieces. Setting aside this bit of promotion, please stick around as we tell you more about how to get involved in future Jane Austen and Company events. But first, we would like to take this moment to thank our sponsors for this program, including the Orange County Arts Commission and North Carolina Cares, Chapel Hill Public Library, and the Humanities for the Public Good Initiative at UNC Chapel Hill, who provided us with a critical issues grant to partially support this season's series. While their series sponsorship ends with this event, we hope that we can rely on your own financial generosity as we work to offer programs just like this and others related moving forward. This support keeps our events free and open to the public, in addition to funding scholarships for middle and high school teachers. It is these educators who keep Jane Austen and her contemporaries alive for the next generation of readers. And if you're present tonight, I'm sure that you agree there is no such thing as too many Austenites. As a nonprofit, contributions of any amount are not only tax deductible for US residents, but they also go far in showing how Jane Austen's work and world matter now more than ever. Thank you for considering where our organization fits into your own giving. And allow me to now hand things over for a brief word from one of our partners, the Chapel Hill Public Library.
And the exciting contest news. Yay.
Yes. Hello. My name is Maya James. I'm a staff member here at Chapel Hill Public Library. On behalf of the town of Chapel Hill and the library, thank you so much, Devoney, for your great presentation. We have so enjoyed teaming up with Jane Austen and Company on Race in the Regency and A Truth Universally Re-Acknowledged, the Pride and Prejudice Writing Contest. And I'm excited to announce the winners tonight. Our judges were Martha Waters, author of To Have and to Hoax, Susan Brown, director of Chapel Hill Public Library, and Sonia Kamal, author of Unmarriageable. The submissions we received were wide-ranging and really fun and well done. I heard from the judges that it was very hard to narrow down the winners, but we do have 3 winners to announce, and all 3 will be receiving a swag bag from Chapel Hill Public Library, as you can see here behind me, and of course, entry into the Jane Austen Summer Program. You'll also be able to read their submissions on janeaustenandco.org soon, so look out for an email from us soon with the link to read those. So the first prize of the night is a Young Writer Award going to Hannah Engel. Hannah is an 8th grade student at Smith Middle School here in Chapel Hill. She loves reading, writing, and especially history. Congratulations, Hannah. And it was a very tight race for the grand prize. The very close second place goes to Maddie Ellis. Maddie Ellis is a rising senior at UNC Chapel Hill studying English and journalism. Congratulations, Maddie. And finally, our first prize goes to Elizabeth Gilliland. Elizabeth received her PhD from Louisiana State University in 2018, where she wrote her dissertation on Jane Austen adaptations, Jane Austen's Hidden Bodies adaptation as critical commentary. She is the author of the upcoming Austen University series, Austen retellings set in modern day with all of Austen's characters combined, plus murder, soon to be published by Bayou Wolf Press. So be on the lookout for that, it's coming soon. So congratulations to Hannah, Maddie, and Elizabeth. I'll be in touch with you soon to get you your prizes. And to all of you watching tonight, you'll be getting an email from us when the submissions are available to read on janeaustenandco.org. So definitely check them out once they're posted. Thank you all so much to everybody who submitted your work. We had so many really, really enjoyable submissions. And like I said, it was so hard to choose a winner. But thank you all so much. And I hope that we'll see more writing from all of you. Thanks again to Jane Austen and Company for working with us to make this contest a reality. And thank you so much to our wonderful judges as well.
Yeah, thank you. Congratulations. And thank you, Maya, so much for coordinating things at the library for us. And everyone, we would love your feedback on your experience with this series. We're going to be sending around a survey. And right afterwards, we would also love your ideas for future series. Again, I mentioned last time that Asia and the Regency is one of the things we're considering for the fall. But we will be sending the survey by email. And I think there may be a link as well. Yeah, there's a link in the chat for you as well. So please fill that out and let us know how we can continue to provide quality programming like this Race in the Regency series. Thanks everybody. Thank you especially to Devoney for closing us off in this productive way and opening us up, actually is more the appropriate way of saying it, to new ideas and new mandates, new goals. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you remain healthy and safe until we're able to meet again. For those of you coming to the Jane Austen Summer Program, that will be pretty soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Devoney. Thanks, everybody.